Welcome back. Book 4, Plato's Republic. It's yeah, we had to take a bit of a break. Friday was a school closure Friday, so we went to the mountain and did some more skiing. Then we had the weekend, and then Monday was family day, which I totally forgot about last week. Um, but yeah, here we are, ready to go for book 4. I also just wanted to show. Here's my statue of little Plato here. He's holding the Republic in his hand. Um, uh, and so on it says Plato, 427 to 347 BC, BCE, which is what it should be say. And then it has 4 quotes from him that I'll just read for you. Good people do not need laws to tell them to act responsibly, while bad people will find a way around the laws. He who steals a little steals with the same wish as he who steals much, but with less power. He who commits injustice is ever made more wretched than he who suffers it. Ignorance, the root and stem of all evil. Which is interesting take. We use Plato currently, the statue. It sits on our desk right behind me, and it's for all of our hair elastics. So he looks like he always has a little necklace around him, kind of like those Hawaiian leis. I don't. Yeah. So, anyways, that's my little Play-Doh statue. It was excessively. It was like $200 almost, but it's fun to have around the house. So, anyways, getting to book 4 of the Republic. It's I haven't read this in a long time, so it's kind of as much of a surprise to me as it'll be to you. So here we go. And Adeimantus interrupted and said, "What would your apology be, Socrates, if someone were to say to you, you're hardly making these men happy, and further, that it's their own fault? They to whom the city in truth belongs, but who enjoy nothing good from the city as do others, who possess land and build fine big houses, and possess all the accessories that go along with these things, and make private sacrifices to gods, and entertain foreigners, and of course also acquire what you were just talking about, gold and silver and all that's conventionally held to belong to men who are going to be blessed." But he would say, "They look exactly like mercenary auxiliaries, who sit in the city and do nothing but keep watch." "Yes," I said, "and besides, they do it for food alone. They get no wages beyond the food, and as do the rest. So if they should wish to make a private trip away from home, it won't even be possible for them, or give gifts to lady companions, or make expenditures whatever else they happen to wish, such as those made by the men reputed to be happy. You leave these things and a throng of others like them out of the accusation." "Well," he said, "let them too be part of the accusation. You ask what our apology will be then?" "Yes." Okay. "Making our way by the same road," I said, "I suppose we'll find what has to be said. We'll say that it wouldn't be surprising if these men, as they were, are also happiest. However, in founding the city, we are not looking to the exceptional happiness of any one group among us, but, as far as possible, that of the city as a whole. We suppose we would find justice most in such a city, and injustice, in its turn, in the worst governed one. And taking a careful look at them, we would judge what we've been seeking for so long. Now then, we suppose we're fashioning the happy city, a whole city, not setting apart a happy few and putting them in it. We'll consider its opposite presently, just as if we were painting statues and someone came up and began to blame us, saying that we weren't putting the fairest colors on the fairest parts of the animal, for the eyes, which are the fairest, had not been painted purple but black. We would seem to make a sensible apology to him by saying, 'You surprising man, don't you suppose we ought to paint eyes so fair that they don't even look like eyes, and the same for the other parts? But observe whether, assigning what's suitable to each of them, we make the whole fair. So now too, don't compel us to attach to the guardians a happiness that will turn them into everything except guardians. We know how to clothe the farmers in fine robes, and hang gold on them, and bid them work the earth at their pleasure, and how to make the potters recline before the fire, drinking in competition from left to right, and feasting, and having their wheels set before them as often as they desire to make pots, and how to make all the others blessed in the same way, just so the city as a whole may be happy. But don't give us this kind of advice, since if we were to be persuaded by you, the farmer won't be a farmer, nor the potter a potter, nor will anyone else assume any of those roles that go to make up the city. I'm going to stop here for a sec. I think it's interesting. I've been listening to some theories of economics. Like you get to the Chicago School, the Kensington economic model, and more European like social uh, social oriented economic models. And it's just interesting how like even though there's a perhaps like a lot of math involved in the actual playing out of economics, the underlying goals of economics are all to do with philosophy, and what your goal is will determine what kind of model you pursue. And like the Chicago School is really just like a free market based with Milton Friedman, and where it's like the invisible hand of the market will control uh, the market and will push for change and will buy. And it's like this presumption that like one, people are rational human beings, and number two, that like people will fight for their own um, self-actualization, and so therefore the market will have to respond accordingly. But we know that in practice that like it really doesn't work out that way, and really the only the rich and powerful end up being able to take advantage of the system. Of course, like they would disagree with that, but like in reality we could see that that's what happens time and time again. And like the Kensington model is like these are like Chicago and the Kensington model. The Kensington model, Keynesian model is like the model like Obama used, which is where the government only intervenes when it's necessary. So it's largely a free market system, but the government needs to intervene to like prime the pumps and like get the economy moving back once there is a correction, or to take their foot off the gas and to slow the economy down so that you don't go into hyperinflation or too much of a depressionary cycle. And so it's like the idea is like you're priming the pumps and making sure that the economy continues running properly. Where like this like more European model is very much in line with looking out for the whole, as in like the economy is supposed to work for everyone. And that's really the idea of what we try to pursue here in Canada. And so we don't like it when we have people who just blatantly take advantage of the Canadian consumers. Um, so like I think there's a lot of pushback against someone um, like the Weston family, who runs like a lot of the grocery stores in Canada, and they see how much money he makes. That we see these CEO salaries, and we're like, why aren't you there for the good of the people? You do not need these excessive salaries. And of course, they point to how much money other CEOs make, and they point to like how much it costs in order to attract talented CEOs in order to because I think Galen Weston is only the chair of the board, where they have a CEO who actually runs the day-to-day operations. And um, in order to get a good CEO, you need to pay top dollar. And and of course, this is like largely like the free market at work, but we see these excessive like why would you ever need a salary over $1 million is beyond me. And it's quite frankly embarrassing when like they're not willing to step up to the plate to help their employees. Of course they have market obligations, and I think this is part of the problem with the capitalist system in general, is that there's no incentive to ensure that the system works for the whole. There's only from the company's perspective, the only motivation they have is to increase their profit margin and to increase that bottom line. And so unless there is sufficient force against them, working against them, there is literally no incentive. And that is the fundamental problem, is that there is no controls into saying like, oh, it is only morally acceptable to take 10% profit on goods. Like cost plus 10%. Mark Cuban's pharmaceutical company, he does cost plus 10%. And so you have a very fair model where he he very clearly tells you how much profit he's taking, and you, as the consumer, only pay that baseline cost plus 10%, and he pockets that 10% because of course he wants to make money. But by being a fair and transparent system, he's not taking advantage of the consumer. He's still making money, and he already has enough money where it doesn't even matter to him. Like, this is only a drop in the bucket from his vast fortune already. But it's a fair way. That's a fair handshake agreement between like society and the billionaire, whereby both profit fairly equally. And I guess I just don't understand why more of the market can't operate in that capacity where we limit profits to that 5 to 10%, uh, and they can try to leverage it on the back end and manipulate their markets, which would be fine, and as long as it's not hurting the consumer. And certainly a lot of banks do that, but you have all these anti-consumer things in Canada. For instance, like currently, like I'm not working, but like yet my bank continues to charge me like $6-7 a month just to have a bank account open, and it's like this is very clearly predatory. And a but if I have more than an X amount of dollars within my bank account, then they would stop charging that to me completely. And of course, they need to make money, but goodness gracious, like, how are you becoming poor in this country becomes exponentially more expensive. You have all these surcharges that get added on, especially if, like, oh, say you didn't have sufficient funds in your account, which I do, but or these monthly fees for not having um, enough money in your account. There's just not enough protections in place, and so we have these like liberal governments that come into place and add all these regulations, and certainly they could go much further in trying to protect the Canadian consumers. But it doesn't. There's no incentive from the capitalist perspective to ever look out for the goodness of the citizens in general, and there's no driving motivation to actually work towards those ends. Some companies I've been quite impressed with, like Walmart, for instance, they operate with like $500 billion in revenue, but they only actually see $5 to $10 billion of profit per quarter, which is astoundingly it it's quite impressive because those are relatively narrow margins, and of course they've had time to build up a massive reserve fund to be able to protect and hedge against that narrow margin in case sales dip or whatever. But um, it's still a lot of money being put into their own pockets at the expense of the consumers. And granted, they have a global presence, and perhaps that like that 10%, that 10 to what would that be, 10 to 20% profit that they're making off of $500 billion in revenue. Of course, I haven't looked at those numbers in a long time, but like it's it's a lot, and it takes, and we can see how that's affecting, um, without the government intervening to be a forward-leaning society, as in reinvesting money heavily into young people and providing new job opportunities for young people. The We very quickly end up in a late stage capitalist environment where the rich just keep amassing all the wealth, consumers keep getting taken advantage of. There is no real opportunity for that free market capitalism to take place because you need billions of dollars of investment in order to be more efficient than uh, to even have something more efficient or to be competitive against these major players in whatever space you're trying to disrupt. And so it's not fair to assume that a Chicago school of thought or this free market system could ever exist properly and be ever fully expressed in this modern economy that really works well in like local economic scales where it's just one small shop competing against another. That's a fair system for them to compete against each other. But when you're dealing with these um, people who think they're demigods and who think that they deserve all this wealth, and that you're just creating billionaires who provide no value to society in general because they're not willing to build libraries, they're not willing to give back like the billionaires of the past. They're not willing to look out for the social good and to Henry Ford was a great example of that, where he amassed this fortune, and then he paid his workers above minimum wage, and he went above and beyond to ensure that they would be loyal to him because he wanted good workers, and he recognized that he didn't need all this money. He didn't need more and more money for his own sake. Like, how else was he going to spend it? What else was he going to spend it on? But the capitalists of today, they seem to believe that there's no end, no bounds to their uh, what their wealth should be, and it's honest. I mean, we all know this, and it's disgusting, obviously. But it's nice to get back to these roots and to be looking at, like, what should the point of a city be? And in the Republic here, we very clearly see that the basis of the economic system should very much be in favor of the people. CD Howe just released a survey, not that, like, maybe a week or two ago, uh, noting that, like, Canada used to be number 5 in world happiness rankings in for countries, um, but if you look at those under the age of 30, and this came out February 2025, or perhaps maybe January, because I might have just seen it late, but recently, if you just looked at people under the age of 30, we would rank 58th in terms of happiness on the happiness index. The only people who have retained their a relative high level of happiness in this country are those over the age of 60. And now, I'm not trying to diminish their efforts by any means, but it was certainly a lot easier to build wealth in previous generations than it is now. We see this whole mass of people who have gone to university and have achieved higher degrees of education than their parents, and who are very intelligent in the way they pursue things. Or, and, like, perhaps there's criticism there as well, but it's a lot harder to make money now than it ever has been before. And if all of this is on the government to fix, it doesn't seem like it's realistic unless you have a very dominating and controlling society, and you kind of fix the central money problem of how you can be forward leaning and bring investment and jobs into for the benefit of younger people. But the entrepreneurship class of the future is certainly much more difficult to get into than it has been in the past. Like, in the past, you could just start up a business that would be instantly competitive because you could put all this labor into it, and certainly you could do that with um, things like that require manual labor. But as soon as you get into, say, computer science, or competing against these major like, you certainly can't just open a grocery store and expect to be competitive against these major players. So the world has definitely changed, and it's unsurprising that younger people, younger than under the age of 30, are just having such a tougher time with this economy than previous generations. That's for sure. And so, like, I think it's important, like, economics is very much a social science first, and therefore we need to determine what the point of the economy is for. And if it's for the people, then we very clearly need to reframe some of our central notions of what the point of a company is for, how much profit they should be taking, what kind of consumer protections need to be in place, and how we can ensure that we are a forward-leaning country to ensure that our young people not only have opportunities, but they'll actually want to stay in the country and contribute to the to Project Humanity within our own country. Because you can see a lot of people are becoming very disenfranchised with this system, and that's why a lot of people are turning to extremist policies, and um, without real solutions, I mean, you just end up in scary places where people just turn to the most extreme option as a way to disrupt what's currently going on. Um, Nevertheless, let's go back to the text, and we'll talk more later. Okay. We know how to clothe the farmers in fine robes and hang gold on them, and bid them work the earth at their pleasure, and how to make the potters recline before the fire, drinking in competition from left to right, and feasting, and having their wheels set before them as often as they get the desire to make pots, and how to make all the others blessed in the same way, just so the city as a whole may be happy. But don't give us this kind of advice, since, if we were to be persuaded by you, the farmer won't be a farmer, nor the potter a potter, nor will anyone else assume any of those roles that go to make up a city. The argument has less weight for these others, that men should become poor menders of shoes, corrupted and pretending to be what they're not, isn't so terrible for a city. But you surely see that men who are not guardians of the laws in the city, but seem to be, utterly destroy an entire city, just as they alone are masters of the occasion to govern it well and to make it happy. Now, if we're making true guardians, men least likely to do harm to the city, and the one who made that speech is making some farmers and happy banqueters, like men at the public festival and not like members of a city, then he must be speaking of something other than a city. So we have to consider whether we are establishing the guardians looking to their having the most happiness, or else, whether looking to this happiness for the city as a whole, we must see if it comes to be in the city, and must compel and persuade these auxiliaries and guardians to do the same, so that they'll be the least possible craftsmen at their jobs, and similarly for all the others. And when the entire city growing thus and being fairly founded, we must let nature assign to each of the groups its share of happiness. You seem to me, he said, to speak finely. Then will I said, also seem to you to speak sensibly if I say what is akin to that? What exactly? Take the other craftsmen again and consider whether these things corrupt them so as to make them bad. What are they? Wealth and poverty, I said. How? Like this, in your opinion, will a potter who's gotten rich still be willing to attend to his art? Not at all, he said. And will he become idler and more careless than he was? By far. Doesn't he become a worse potter then? That too, by far, he said. Then further, if from poverty he's not even able to provide himself with the tools or anything else for his art, he'll produce shoddier works, and he'll make worse craftsmen of his sons or any others he teaches. Of course. Then from both poverty and wealth, the products of the arts are worse and the men themselves are worse. It looks like it. So it seems we found other things for the guardians to guard against, in every way, so that these things never slip into the city without their awareness. What are they? Wealth and poverty, I said. Since the one produces luxury, idleness, and innovation, while the other produces illiberality and wrongdoing, as well as innovation. Most certainly, he said. However, Socrates, consider this. How will our city be able to make war when it possesses no money, especially if it's compelled to make war against the wealthy one? It's plain, I said, that against one it would be harder, but against two of that sort it would be easier. How do you mean? He said. Well, I said, in the first place, if the guardians should have to fight, won't it be as champions in war, fighting with the rich men? Yes, he said, that's so. Now then, Adeimantus, I said, in your opinion, wouldn't one boxer with the finest possible training in the art easily fight with two rich, fat non-boxers? Perhaps not at the same time, he said. Not even if it were possible for him to withdraw a bit, I said. And turning on whichever one came first, to strike him, and if he did this repeatedly in sun and stifling heat, couldn't such a man handle even more of that sort? Undoubtedly, he said. That wouldn't be at all surprising. But don't you suppose the rich have more knowledge and experience of boxing than that of the art of war? I do, he said. Then in all likelihood, our champions would easily fight with 2 or 3 times their number. I'll grant you that, he said, for what you say is right in my opinion. Well, if they sent an embassy to the other city and told the truth, we make use of neither gold nor silver, nor is it lawful for us, while it is for you. So join us in making war and keep the other's property. Do you suppose that any who hear that will choose to make war against solid, lean dogs, rather than with dogs against fat and tender sheep? Not in my opinion, he said. But if the money of the others is gathered into one city, look out that it doesn't endanger the city, that it isn't rich. You are a happy one, I said. If you suppose that it is fit to call the city, it is fit to call city another than such as we have been equipping. What else then? He said. The others ought to get bigger names, I said, for each of them is very many cities, but not a city, as those who play say. There are two, in any case, warring with each other, one of the poor, the other of the rich, and within each of these there are very many. If you approach them as though they were one, you'll be a complete failure. But if you approach them as though they were many, offering to the ones the money and the powers or the very persons of the others, you'll always have the use of many allies and few enemies. And as long as your city is moderately governed in the way it was just arranged, it will be biggest. I do not mean in the sense of good reputation, but truly biggest, even if it should be made up of only 100,000 defenders. Only of 1,000 defenders. You'll not easily find one city so big as this, either among the Greeks or the barbarians, although many seem to be many times its size. Or do you suppose otherwise? No, by Zeus. Therefore, I said, this would also be the fairest boundary for our rulers. So big must they make the city, and bounding off enough land so that it will be of that size, they must let the rest go. What boundary? He said. I suppose this one, I said. Up to that point in its growth that which is willing to be one. Let it grow and not beyond. That's fine, he said. Therefore, we'll also set this further command on the guardians, to guard in every way against the city being little or seemingly big. Rather, it should be sufficient and one. This is, he said, perhaps a slight task we will impose on them. And still slighter than that, I said, is what we mentioned earlier when we said that if a child of slight ability were born to the guardians, he would have been sent off to the others, and if a serious one were born of the others, he would have to be sent off to the guardians. This was intended to make plain that each of the other citizens too must be brought to that which naturally suits him. One man, one job, so that each man practicing his own, which is one, will not become many, but one. And thus, you see, the whole city will naturally grow to be one and not many. This is indeed, he said, a lesser task than the other. Yet, my good Adamantius, I said, there are not, as one might think, many great commands we are imposing on them, but they are all slight. If, as the saying goes, they guard the one great, or rather the great, or rather than great, sufficient thing. They guard the one great, or rather than great, sufficient thing. What's that? He said. Their education and rearing, I said. If by being well educated they become sensible men, they'll easily see to all this and everything else we are now leaving out, that the possession of women, marriage, and procreation of children must, as far as possible, be arranged according to the proverb that friends have all things in common. Yes, he said, that would be the most correct way. And hence, I said, the regime once well started will roll on like a circle in its growth, for sound rearing and education, when they are preserved, produce good natures, and sound natures, in their turn, receiving such an education, grow up still better than those before them, for procreation as well as the other things, as is also the case with the other animals. It's likely, he said. Now, to state it briefly, the overseers of the city must cleave to this, not letting it be corrupted unawares, but guarding it against all comers. There must be no innovation in gymnastic and music contrary to the established order, but they will guard against it as much as they can, fearing that when someone says, quote, human beings esteem most that song which floats newest from the singer, end quote. Someone must perchance suppose the poet means not new songs, but a new way of song, and praises that. Such a saying shouldn't be praised, nor should this one be taken in that sense. For they must beware of change to a strange form of music, taking it to be a danger to the whole. For never are the ways of music moved through without the greatest political laws being moved, as Damon says, and I am persuaded. Include me too, said Adamantius, among those who are persuaded. So it's surely here in music as it seems, I said, that the guardians must build the guardhouse. At least, he said, this kind of lawlessness easily creeps in unawares. Yes, I said, since it considered to be a kind of play and to do no harm. It doesn't do any either, he said, except that, establishing itself bit by bit, it flows gently beneath the surface into the dispositions and practices, and from there it emerges bigger in men's contracts with one another. And it's from the contracts, Socrates, that it attacks laws and regimes with much insolence until it finally subverts everything private and public. Well, well, I said. Is that so? In my opinion, he said. Then, as we were saying at the beginning, mustn't our boys take part in the more lawful play straight away, since if it becomes lawless itself, and the children along with it, it's not possible that they'll grow up to be law-abiding good men? Of course they must, he said. It's precisely when the boys make a fine beginning at play and receive lawfulness from music that it, as opposed to what happened in the former case, accompanies them in everything and grows, setting right anything in the city that may have previously been neglected. Quite true, he said. Then these men, I said, will also find out the seemingly small conventions that were all destroyed by their predecessors. What kind of things? Such as the appropriate silence of younger men in the presence of older ones, making way for them in rising, care of parents and hairdos, clothing, shoes, and, as a whole, the bearing of the body, and everything else of that sort. Or don't you think so? I do. But to set them down as laws is, I believe, foolish. Surely they don't come into being, nor would they be maintained by being set down as laws in speech and in writing. How could they be? How could they? At least it's likely, Adeimantus, I said, that the starting point of a man's education sets the course of what follows, too, or doesn't like always call forth like? Of course. Then I suppose we'd also say that the final result is some one complete and hearty thing, whether good or the opposite. Of course, he said. That, I said, is why I, for one, wouldn't go far and undertake to set down laws about such things. That's proper, he said. And in the name of the gods, I said, what about that market business, the contracts individuals make with one another in the market, and, if you wish, contracts with manual artisans, and libel, insult, lodging of legal complaints, and the appointment of judges, and of course, whatever imposts might have to be collected or assessed in the markets or harbors, or any market, town, or harbor regulations, or anything else of the kind. Shall we bring ourselves to set down laws for any of these things? It isn't worthwhile, he said, to dictate to gentlemen most of these things that need legislation. They will, no doubt, easily find for themselves. Yes, my friend, I said, provided that is, God grants them the preservation of the laws we described before. And if not, he said, they'll spend their lives continually setting down many such rules and correcting them, thinking they'll get a hold of the what's best. You mean, I said, that such men will live like those who are sick but, due to licentiousness, aren't willing to quit their worthless way of life? Most certainly. And don't they go on charmingly? For all their treatment, they get nowhere, except, of course, to make their illness more complicated and bigger, always hoping that if someone would just recommend a drug, they will be, thanks to it, healthy. Yes, he said, the afflictions of men who are sick in this way are exactly like that. What about this, I said? Isn't it charming in them that they believe the greatest enemy of all is the man who tells the truth, namely, that until one gives up drinking, stuffing oneself, sex, and idleness, there will be no help for one in drugs, burning, or cutting, nor in charms, pedants, or anything of the sort. Not quite charming, he said. Being harsh with the man who says something good isn't charming. You are not, I said, as it seems a praiser of such men. No, indeed, by Zeus. Therefore, if as we were just saying, the city as a whole behaves like that, you won't praise it either. Or isn't your impression that the very same thing these men do is done by all cities with bad regimes, which warn the citizens they must not disturb the city's constitution as a whole, under pain of death for the man who does, while the man who serves them most agreeably with the regime as it is, and gratifies them by flattering them and knowing their wishes beforehand, and being clever at fulfilling them, will on that account be the good man and the one wise in important things, and be honored by them. They certainly do, he said. Seem to me to act in the same way, and I don't praise them in any respect whatsoever. And what about men who are willing and eager to serve such cities? Don't you admire their courage and facility? I do, he said, except for those who are deceived by them and suppose they are truly statesmen because they are praised by the many. How do you mean? I said. Don't you sympathize with these men? Or do you suppose it's possible for a man who doesn't know how to take measurements not to believe it when many other men like him say he's a 6-footer? No, he said, that I don't suppose. Then don't be harsh, for such men are surely the most charming of all, setting down laws like the ones we've described a moment ago, and correcting them, always thinking they'll find some limit to wrongdoing in contracts and the other things I was just talking about. Ignorant, they are really cutting off the heads of a hydra. Well, he said, they do nothing but that. The hydra is the Greek animal that when you cut off one head, 3 more grow in its place. And I think it's also interesting. There's, I believe there's some research done that says something along the lines of the more lawyers a society has, the less efficient that economy is. I mean, that it's just common sense, but it's interesting to note that it's backed by research. I don't have that source on hand, but I could certainly look it up if you're interested. I, for one, I said, therefore thought that the true lawgiver wouldn't have to bother with that class of things in the laws and the regime, either in a city with a bad regime or in one with a good regime. In the one case, because it's useless and accomplishes nothing. In the other, partly because anyone at all could find some of these things, and partly because the rest follow of themselves from the practices already established. Then what, he said, might still remain for our legislation. And I said, for us nothing. However, for the Apollo at Delphi, there remained the greatest, fairest, and first of the laws which are given. What are they about? He said. Founding of temples, sacrifices, and whatever else belongs to the care of gods, demons, and heroes, and further, burial of the dead, and all the services needed to keep those in that other place gracious. For such things as these we neither know ourselves, nor in founding a city shall we be persuaded by any other men. If we are intelligent, nor shall we make use of any interpreter other than the ancestral one. Now this God is doubtless the ancestral interpreter of such things for all humans, and he sits in the middle of the earth and at its navel and delivers his interpretations. What you say is fine, he said, and that's what must be done. So then, son of Ariston, I said, your city would now be founded. In the next place, you'll get an adequate light somewhere. And look yourself and call in your brother and Polymarchus and the others, whether we can somehow see where the justice might be and where the injustice, and in what they differ from one another, and which the man who's going to be happy must possess, whether it escapes the notice of all gods and humans or not. You're talking nonsense, said Glaucon. You promised you would look for it, because it's not holy for you not to bring help to justice in every way in your power. What you remind me of is true, I said, and though I must do so, you two have to join us. We'll do so, he said. Now then, I said, I hope I'll find it in this way. I suppose our city, if that is, it has been correctly founded, is perfectly good. Necessarily, he said. Plainly, then, it's wise, courageous, moderate, and just. Plainly. Isn't it the case that whichever of them we happen to find will leave as the remainder what hasn't been found? Of course. Therefore, just as with any other four things, if we were seeking any one of them in something or other and recognized it first, that would be enough for us. But if we recognized the other three first, this would also suffice for the recognition of the thing looked for. For plainly it couldn't be anything but what's left over. What you say is correct, he said. With these things too, since they happen to be four, mustn't we look for them in the same way? Plainly. Well, it's wisdom, in my opinion, which first comes plainly to light in it, and something about it looks strange. What, he said? The city we described is really wise, in my opinion. That's because of its good counsel, isn't it? Yes. And further, this very thing, good counsel, is plainly a kind of knowledge. For it's surely not by lack of learning, but by knowledge, that men counsel well. Plainly. But on the other hand, there's much knowledge of all sorts in the city. Of course. Then, it's thanks to the carpenter's knowledge that the city must be called wise, and of good counsel. Not at all, he said. Thanks to that it's called skilled in carpentry. Then it's not thanks to the knowledge that counsels about how wood implements would be best that a city must be called wise. Surely not. And what about this? Is it thanks to the knowledge of bronze implements or any other knowledge of such things? Not to any knowledge of this sort, he said. And not to the knowledge about the production of the crop from the earth? For that, rather, is called skilled in farming. That's my opinion. What about this, I said. Is there in the city we just founded a kind of knowledge belonging to some kind of citizens that counsels not about the affairs connected with some particular thing in the city, but about how the city as a whole would best deal with itself and the other cities? There is indeed. What and in whom is it? I said. It's the Guardians Guild, he said, and it's in those rulers whom we just now named perfect guardians. Thanks to this knowledge, what do you call the city? Of good counsel, he said, and really wise. Then, do you suppose, I said, that there will be more smiths in our city than these true guardians? Far more smiths, he said. Among those, I said, who receive a special name for possessing some kind of knowledge, wouldn't the guardians of the fewest of all be the fewest of all in number? By far. It is therefore from the smallest group, and part of itself, and in knowledge in it, from the supervising and ruling part, that a city founded according to nature would be wise as a whole, and this class which properly has a share in that knowledge, which alone among the various kinds of knowledge ought to be called wisdom, has, as it seems, the fewest members by nature. What you say, he said, is very true. So we found, I don't know how, this one of the four, both it and where its seat in the city is. I'm going to read that again. So we found, I don't know how, this one of the four, both it and where its seat in the city is. In my opinion, at least, he said, it has been satisfactorily discovered. And next, courage, both itself and as well as where it's situated in the city, that courage thanks to which the city must be called courageous, isn't very hard to see. How's that? Who, I said, would say a city is cowardly or courageous while looking to any other part than the one that defends it and takes the field on its behalf? There's no one, he said, who would look to anything else. I don't suppose, I said, that whether the other men in it are cowardly or courageous would be decisive for its being this or that. No, it wouldn't. So a city is also courageous by a part of itself, thanks to that part's having in its power through everything will preserve the opinion about which things are terrible, that they are the same ones and of the same sort as those the lawgiver transmitted in the education. Or don't you call that courage? I didn't quite understand what you said, he said. Say it again. I mean, I said, that courage is a certain kind of preserving. Just what sort of preserving? The preserving of the opinion produced by law through education about what, and what sort of thing, is terrible. And by preserving through everything, I meant preserving that opinion and not casting it out in pains and pleasures and desires and fears. If you wish, I'm willing to compare it to what I think it's like. But I do wish. Don't you know, I said, that the dyers, when they want to dye wool purple, will first choose from all the colors the single nature belonging to white things. Then they prepare it beforehand and care for it with no little preparation, so that it will most receive the color, and it is only then that they dye. If a thing is dyed in this way, it becomes color fast, and washing either without lies or with lies can take away its color. But those things that are not so dyed, whether one dyes other colors or this one without preparatory care, you know what they become like. I do know, he said, that they're washed out and ridiculous. Hence, I said, take it that we too were, to the extent of our power, doing something similar when we selected the soldiers and educated them in music and gymnastics. Don't think we devised all that for any other purpose than that. Persuaded by us, they should receive the laws from us in the finest possible way, like a dye, so that their opinion about what's terrible and about everything else would be color fast, because they had gotten the proper nature and rearing, and their dye could not be washed out by those lies so terribly effective at scorning pleasure, more terribly effective for this than any chalistering soda, and alkali, and pain, fear, and desire, worse than any other lie. This kind of power and preservation, through everything, of the right and lawful opinion about what is terrible and what not, about what is terrible and what not, I call courage, and so I set it down unless you say something else. But I don't say anything else, he said. For in my opinion, you regard the right opinion about these same things that comes to be without education, that found in beasts and slaves as not at all lawful, and call it something other than courage. What say you, I said, is very true. Well then, I accept this as courage. Yes, do accept it, but as a political courage, I said, and you'd be right in accepting it. Later, if you want, we'll give it a still finer treatment. At the moment, we weren't looking for it. But for justice, for that search, I suppose this is sufficient. What you say is fine, he said. Well now, I said, there are still two left that must be seen in the city, moderation, and that for the sake of which we are making the whole search, justice. Most certainly. How could we find justice so we won't have to bother about moderation any further? I, for my part, don't know, he said, nor would I want to come to light before if we aren't going to consider moderation any further. If you want to gratify me, consider this before the other. I do want to, I said, so as not to do an injustice. Then consider it, he said. It must be considered, I said. Seen from here, it's more like a kind of accord and harmony than the previous ones. How? Moderation, I said, is surely a kind of order and mastery of certain kinds of pleasures and desires, as men say when they use, I don't know in what way, the phrase stronger than himself. And some other phrases of that sort are used that are, as it were, it tracks. Isn't that so? Most certainly, he said. Isn't the phrase stronger than himself ridiculous, though? For of course, the one who's stronger than himself wouldn't would also be weaker than himself, and the weaker stronger. The same himself is referred to in all of them. Of course it is. But I said, this speech looks to me as if it wants to say that concerning the soul in the same human being there is something better and something worse. The phrase stronger than himself is used when that which is better by nature is master over that which is worst, at least in its praise, and when, from bad training or some association, the smaller and better part is mastered by the inferior multitude, then is, as though it were a reproach, is blamed, and the man is in this condition is called weaker than himself and licentious. Yes, he said, that's likely. Now then, I said, take a glance at our young city, and you'll find one of these conditions in it. For you'll say that it's justly designated stronger than itself, if that in which the better rules over the worse must be called moderate and stronger than itself. Well, I am glancing at it, he said, and what you say is true. And further, one would find many diverse desires, pleasures and pains, especially in children, women, domestics, and in those who are called free among the common many. Most certainly. Notably, we're just reading the text. We're not trying to impose anything when we're trying to say that women are quote unquote weaker or less moderate, or talking about slaves at all in any course. We're just reading the text and trying to ignore those parts of it so we can understand the better meanings of it. Much like what they do in Christianity when they ignore the parts of the Bible that they don't like, when it talks about slaves and the parts that they disagree with. Most certainly. But the simple and moderate desires, pleasures and pains, those led by calculation accompanied by intelligence and right opinion, you will come upon in few, and those the ones born with the best natures and best educated. True, he said. Don't you see that all these are in your city too, and that the desire in the common many are mastered by the desires and the prudence in the more decent few? I do, he said. If, therefore, any city ought to be designated stronger than pleasures, desires, and itself, then this one must be so called. That's entirely certain, he said. And then moderate in all these respects too. Very much so, he said. And moreover, if there is any city in which the rulers and the ruled have the same opinion about who should rule, then it's this one. Or doesn't it seem so? Very much so indeed, he said. In which of the citizens will you say the moderation resides when they are in this condition? Is it the rulers or the ruled? In both, surely, he said. You see, I said, we divined pretty accurately a while ago that moderation is like a kind of harmony. Why so? Because it's unlike courage and wisdom, each of which resides in a part, the one making the city wise, the other courageous. Moderation doesn't work that way, but actually stretches throughout the whole, from top to bottom of the entire scale, making the weaker, the stronger, and those in the middle, whether you wish to view them as such in terms of prudence, or, if you wish, in terms of strength, or multitude, money, or anything else whatsoever of the sort, sing the same chant together. So we would quite rightly claim that this unanimity is moderation, in accord of worse and better, according to nature, as to which must rule in the city and in each one. I am, he said, very much of the same opinion. All right, I said. 3 of them have been spied out in our city, at least sufficiently to form some opinion. Now, what would be the remaining form, thanks to which the city would further partake in virtue? For plainly, this is justice. Plainly. So then, Glaucon, we must, like hunters, now station ourselves in a circle around the thicket and pay attention so that justice doesn't slip through somewhere and disappear into obscurity. Clearly, it's somewhere hereabouts. look to it, and make every effort to catch sight of it. You might somehow see it before me and could tell me. If only I could, he said. However, if you use me as a follower and a man able to see what's shown him, you'll be making something quite sensible. You'll be making quite sensible use of me. Follow, I said, and pray with me. I'll do that, he said. Just lead. The place really appears to be hard going and steeped in shadows, I said. At least it's dark and hard to search out. But all the same, we've got to go on. Yes, he said, we've got to go on. And I caught sight of it and said, Hear, hear, Glaucon, maybe we've come upon a track, and, in my opinion, it will hardly get away from us. That's good news, you report, he said. My, I said, that was a stupid state we were in. How's that? It appears, you blessed man, that it's been rolling around at our feet from the beginning, and we couldn't see it after all, but we're quite ridiculous. As men holding on to something in their hands sometimes seek what they're holding, we too didn't look at it, but turned our gaze somewhere far off, which is also perhaps just the reason it escaped our notice. How do you mean? He said. It's this way, I said. In my opinion, we have been saying and hearing it all along without learning from ourselves that we were in a way saying it. A long prelude, he said, for one who desires to hear? Listen whether after all I make any sense, I said. That rule we set down at the beginning so as what must be done in everything when we were founding the city. This, or a certain form of it, is, in my opinion, justice. Surely we set down and often said, if you remember, that each one must practice one of the functions of the city, that one for which his nature made him naturally most fit. Yes, we were saying that. And further, that justice is the minding of one's own business, and not being a busybody. This we have both heard from the many others, and have often said ourselves. Yes, we have. Well then, my friend, I said. This, the practice of minding one's own business when it comes into being in a certain way, is probably justice. Do you know how I infer this? No, he said. Tell me. In my opinion, I said, after having considered moderation, courage, and prudence, this is what's left over in the city. It provided the power by which all these others came into being, and once having come into being, it provided them with preservation as long as it's in the city. And yet we were saying that justice would be what's left over from the three if we found them. Yes, we did, and it's necessarily so. Okay. 125. Okay, so we have about 13 pages left. Yes, we did, and it's necessarily so. Moreover, I said, if one had to judge which of them by coming to be will do our city the most good, it would be a difficult judgment. Is it the unity of opinion among rulers and ruled, or is it coming into being within the soldiers of that preserving of the lawful opinion as to which things are terrible and which things are not? Or is it the prudence and guardianship present in the rulers? Or is the city done the most good by the fact that, in the case of child, woman, slave, freeman, craftsman, ruler, and ruled, each one minded his own business and wasn't a busybody? It would, of course, he said, be a difficult judgment. Then, as it seems, with respect to a city's virtue, this power that consists in each man's minding of his own business, and in the city is a rival to wisdom, moderation, and courage. Very much so. Wouldn't you name justice that which is the rival of these others in contributing to a city's virtue? That's entirely certain. Now consider if it will seem the same from this viewpoint too. Will you assign the judging of lawsuits in the city to the rulers? Of course. Will they have any other aim in the judging than that no one have what belongs to others, nor be deprived of what belongs to him? None other than this. Because that's just? Yes. And therefore, from this point of view too, the having and doing of one's own and what belongs to oneself would be agreed to be justice. the having and doing of one's own and what belongs to oneself would be agreed to be justice. That's so. Now see if you have the same opinion as I do. Are carpenters trying to do the job of a shoemaker, or a shoemaker of that of a carpenter? Or they're exchanging tools or honors with one another, or even the same man trying to do both, with everything else being changed along with it? In your opinion, would that do any great harm to the city? Hardly, he said. But I suppose when one who is a craftsman or some other kind of money maker by nature, inflated by wealth, multitude, strength, or something else of the kind, tries to get into the class of the warrior, or one of the warriors who's unworthy into that of the advisor and guardian, and these men exchange tools and honors with one another, or when the same man tries to do all these things at once, then I suppose it's also your opinion that this change in them and this meddling are the destruction of the city. That's entirely certain. Meddling among other classes, among the classes, of which there are three, and exchange with one another, is the greatest harm for the city, and would most correctly be called extreme evil-doing. Quite certainly. Won't you say that the greatest evil-doing against one's own city is injustice? Of course. Then that's injustice. Again, let's say it this way. The opposite of this, the money-making, auxiliary, and guardian classes doing what's appropriate, each of them minding its own business in a city, would be justice, and would make the city just. My opinion, he said, is also that and no other. Let's assert it so positively, let's not assert it so positively just yet, I said. But if from this is applied to human beings singly, and also agreed by us to be justice there, then we'll concede it. What else will there be for us to say? And if not, then we'll consider something else. Now, let's complete the consideration by means of which we thought that if we should attempt to see justice first in some bigger thing and that possessed it, we would be more easily catch sight of what it's like in one man. And it was our opinion that this bigger thing is a city, so we founded one as best as we could, knowing full well that justice would be in a good one at least. Let's apply what came to light there to a single man, and if the two are in agreement, everything is fine. But if something different should turn up in a single man, we'll go back again to the city and test it. Perhaps, considering them side by side and rubbing them together like sticks, we would make justice burst into flame, and once it's come to light, confirm it for ourselves. The way to proceed is as you say, he said, and it must be done. Then I said, is that which one calls the same, whether it's bigger or smaller, unlike, or like, in the respect in which it's called the same? Like, he said. Then the just man will not be any different from the just city with respect to the form itself of justice, but will be like it. Yes, he said, he will be like it. But a city seemed to be just when each of the three classes of natures presented in it minded its own business, and again moderate, courageous, and wise, because of certain other afflictions and habits of these same classes. True, he said. Then it's in this way, my friend, that we'll claim that the single man, with these same forms in his souls, thanks to the same affections as those in the city, rightly lays claim to the same names. Quite necessarily, he said. Now, it's a slight question about the soul we've stumbled upon, you surprising man, I said. Does it have these three forms in it or not? In my opinion, it's hardly a slight question, he said. Perhaps, Socrates, the saying that fine things are hard is true. It looks like it, I said. But know well, Glaucon, that in my opinion, we'll never get a precise grasp of it on the basis of procedures, such as we're now using in the argument. There is another longer and further road leading to it, but perhaps we can do it in a way worthy of what's been said and considered before. Mustn't we be content with that, he said. It would be enough for me to be present. It would be enough for me to present. Well then, I said, I will quite satisfy it will quite satisfy me too. So don't grow weary, he said, but go ahead with the consideration. Isn't it quite necessary for us to agree that the very same forms and dispositions as are in the city are in each of us? Surely they haven't come there from any other place. It would be ridiculous if someone should think that the spiritedness didn't come into the cities from those private men who are just the ones imputed with having this character, such as those in Thrace, Scythica, and pretty nearly the whole upper region, or the love of learning, which one could most impute to our region, or the love of money, which one could affirm is to be found not least among the Phoenicians and those in Egypt. Quite so, he said. This is where he gets into the tripart soul. So noting that in us we have all three natures. But I'll let him explain, of course. Quite so, he said. This is so then, I said, and not hard to know. Surely not. But this... Reason, spirit... Oh yeah, okay. But this now is hard. Do we act in each of these ways as a result of the same part of ourselves? Or are these three parts, and with a different one, we act in each of the different ways? Do we learn with one, become spirited with another of the parts within us, and desire the pleasures of nourishment and generation and all their kin with a third? Or do we act with the soul as a whole in each of them once we are started? This will be hard to determine in a way worthy of the argument. That's my opinion too, he said. Now let's try to determine whether these things are the same or different from each other in this way. How? It's plain that the same thing won't be willing at the same time to do or suffer opposites with respect to the same part and in relation to the same thing. So, if we should ever find that happening in these things, we'll know that they weren't the same but many. All right, now consider what I say. Say on, he said. Is it possible that Is it possible that the same thing at the same time and with respect to the same part should stand still and move? Not at all. Now let's have a still more precise argument so that we won't have any grounds for dispute as we proceed. If someone were to say of 100 men standing still, but moving his hands and his head, that the same man at the same time stands still and moves, I don't suppose we'd claim that it should be said like that, but rather that one part of him stands still and another moves. Isn't that so? Yes, it is. Then, if the man who says this should become still more charming and make the subtle point that tops as holes stand still and moves at the same time when the peg is fixed in the same place and they spin, or that anything else going round in a circle on the same spot does not too, we wouldn't accept it because it's not with respect to the same part of themselves that such things are at the same time both at rest and in motion, but we'd say that they have in them both a straight and a circumference. And with respect to the straight, they stand still since they don't lean in any direction, while with respect to the circumference, they move in a circle. And when the straight inclines to the right, the left, forward, or backward, at the same time that it's spinning, then in no way does it stand still. We'd be right, he said. Then the saying of such things won't scare us, or any the more persuade us that something that is the same, or at the same time, with respect to the same part in relation to the same thing, could ever suffer, be, or do opposites. Not me, at least, I said. All the same, I said. So won't we be compelled to go through all such objections and spend a long time assuring ourselves that they're not true? Let's assume that this is so and go ahead, agreed that if it should ever appear otherwise, all our conclusions based on it will be undone. That, he said, is what must be done. Then, would you set down all such things as opposites to one another? I accept. I said, acceptance to refusal, longing to take something to rejecting it, embracing to thrusting away, whether they are actions or afflictions, won't they make any difference? Yes, he said, they are opposites. What about this? I said. Being thirsty and hungry, and generally the desires, and further, willing and wanting, wouldn't you set all these somewhere in those classes, as we just mentioned? For example, won't you say that the soul of a man who desires either longs for what it desires or embraces that which it wants to become its own? Or again, that insofar as the soul wills that something be supplied to it, it nods assent to itself as though someone had posed a question and reaches out toward the fulfillment of what it wills? I shall. And what about this? Won't we class not wanting and not willing and not desiring with the soul's thrusting away from itself and driving out of itself, and along with all the opposites of the previously mentioned acts? Of course. Now, since this is so, shall we assert that there is a form of desires, and that what we call being thirsty and hungry are the most vivid of them? Yes, he said, we shall assert it. Isn't the one for drink and the other for food? Yes, insofar as it's thirst. Wouldn't it be a desire in the soul for something more than that of which we say it is a desire? For example, is thirst for hot drink or cold, or much or little, or, in a word, for any particular kind of drink? Or isn't it rather that in the case where heat is present in addition to the thirst, the heat would cause the desire to be also for something cold as well? For where coldness, something hot, and where the thirst is much on account of the presence of muchness, it will cause the desire to be for much, and where it's little, for little. But thirsting itself will never be a desire for anything other than that of which it naturally is a desire. For drink alone, and similarly, hungering, will be a desire for food. That's the way it is, he said. Each particular desire itself is only for that particular thing itself, of which it naturally is, while the desire for this or that kind depends on additions. Now let no one catch us unprepared, I said, and cause a disturbance, alleging that no one desires drink, but good drink, nor food, but good food. For everyone, after all, desires good things. If then thirst is a desire, it would be for good drink, or for good whatever it is, and similarly with other desires. Perhaps, he said, the man who says that would seem to make some sense. However, I said, of all things that are such as to be related to something, those that are of a certain kind are related to a thing of a certain kind, as it seems to me, while those that are severely themselves are related only to a thing that is itself. I don't understand, he said. Don't you understand, I said, that the greater is such as to be greater than something? Certainly. Than the less? Yes. And the much greater than the much less. Isn't that so? Yes. And then, also the once greater than the once less, and the going to be greater than the going to be less. Of course, he said. And further, the more in relation to the fewer, the double to the half, and everything of the sort. And again, heavier to lighter, faster to slower, and further, the hot to cold, and everything like them. Doesn't the same thing hold? Most certainly. And what about the various sorts of knowledge? Isn't it the same way? Knowledge itself is knowledge of learning itself, or of whatever it is to which knowledge should be related, while a particular kind of knowledge is of a particular kind of thing. I mean something like this. When knowledge of constructing houses came to be, didn't it differ from the other kinds of knowledge? And was this called house building? Of course. Wasn't this by its being a particular kind of thing that is different from the others? Yes. Since it was related to a particular kind of thing, didn't it too become a particular kind of thing itself? And isn't this the way with which other arts and sorts of knowledge too? It is. Well then, I said, say that what I wanted to say then, if you now understand after all, is that of all things that are such as to be related to something, those that are only themselves are related to things that are only themselves, while those that are related to things of a particular kind are of a particular kind. And I in no sense mean that they are such things, such as the things to which they happen to be related, so that it would follow that the knowledge of things healthy and sick is healthy and sick, and that of bad and good is itself bad and good. But when knowledge became knowledge not of that alone to which knowledge is related, but of a particular sort of thing, and this was health and sickness, it is a consequence also became of a certain sort itself, and this cause it not to be called knowledge simply any more, but with the particular kind having been added to it, medicine. I understand, he said, and in my opinion, that's the way it is. And then, as for thirst, I said, won't you include it among those things that are related to something? Surely thirst is in relation to... I will, he said, and it's related to drink. So a particular sort of thirst is for a particular kind of drink, but thirst itself is neither for much nor little, good nor bad, nor, in a word, for any particular thing, but thirst itself is naturally only for drink. That's entirely certain. Therefore, the soul of a man who's thirsty, insofar as it thirsts, wishes nothing other than to drink, and strives for this, and is impelled towards it, plainly. If ever something draws it back from when it's thirsting, wouldn't that be something different in it from that which thirsts and leads it like a beast to drink? For of course, we say, the same thing wouldn't perform opposed actions concerning the same thing with the same part of itself at the same time. No, it wouldn't. Just as, I suppose, it's not fair to say that of the archer, that his hands at the same time thrust the bow away and draw it near, but the one hand pushes it away and the other hand pulls it. That's entirely certain, he said. Now would we assert that sometimes there are some men who are thirsty but are not willing to drink? Surely, he said, many and often. What would one say about them? Isn't there something in their soul bidding them to drink and something forbidding them to do so? Something different that masters that which bids? In my opinion there is, he said. Doesn't that which forbids such things come into being when it comes into being from calculation? While what leads and draws its what leads and draws is present due to affections and diseases? It looks like it. So we won't be irrational, I said, if we claim that they are two and different from each other, naming the part of the soul with which it calculates, the calculating, and the part with which it loves, hungers, and thirsts, and is agitated by the other desires, the irrational, and desiring, companion of certain replenishments and pleasures. No, we won't, he said. It would be fitting for us to believe that. Therefore, I said, let these two forms in the soul be distinguished. Now, it is the part that contains spirit, and with which we are spirited, a third. Or would it have some other nature as one of these others? Perhaps, he said, the same as one of them, the desiring. But I said, I once heard something that I trust. Leontus, the son of Aglion, was going up from the Pyrrhus under the outside of the north wall. When he noticed corpses lying by the public executioner, he desired to look, but at the same time he was disgusted, and made himself turn away. And for a while he struggled and covered his face. But finally, overpowered by the desire, he opened his eyes wide, ran toward the corpses, and said, "Look, you damned wretches, take your fill of the fair sight." "I too have heard it," he said, This speech, I said, certainly indicates that anger sometimes makes war against the desires as one thing against something else. Yes, he said, it does indicate that. And in many other places, don't we, I said, notice that when desires force someone contrary to calculation, he reproaches himself and his spirit is roused against that in him which is doing the forcing. And just as though there were two parties at faction, such a man's spirit becomes the ally of speech. But as for its making common cause with the desires to do what speech has declared must not be done, I suppose you'd say you had never noticed anything of the kind happening in yourself, nor, I suppose, in anyone else. No, by Zeus, he said. And what about when a man supposes he's doing injustice? The nobler he is, he won't be less capable of anger at suffering hunger, cold, or anything else of that sort inflicted on him by one whom he supposes does so justly. And, as I say, won't his spirit be unwilling to rouse itself against that man? True, he said. And what about when a man believes he's being done injustice? Doesn't his spirit in this case boil and become harsh and form an alliance for battle with which seems just? And even if it suffers in hunger, cold, and everything of the sort, doesn't it stand firm and conquer, and not cease from its noble efforts before it has succeeded, or death intervenes, or because it becomes gentle, having been called in by the speech within him, like a dog by the herdsman? Most certainly, it resembles the likeness you make, and of course, we put the auxiliaries in our city like dogs obedient to the rulers, who are like shepherds of a city. You have, I said, a fine understanding of what I want to say. But beyond that, are you aware of this too? What? That what we are now bringing to light about the spirited is the opposite of our recent assertion. Then we supposed it had something to do with the desiring part, but now, far from it, we say that in the faction of the soul, it sets its arms on the side of the calculating part. Quite so. Is it, then, different from the calculating part as well? Or is it a particular form of it, so that there aren't three forms of the soul, but two, the calculating and the desiring? Or just as there were three classes in the city that held it together, money-making, auxiliary, and deliberative, is there in the soul too this third, the spirited, by nature an auxiliary to the calculating part, if it's not corrupted by bad rearing? Necessarily, he said, there is the third. Yes, I said, if it should come to light as something other than the calculating part, just as it has come to light as different from the desiring part. But it's not hard, he said, for it to come to light as such. For even in little children, one could see that they are full of spirit straight from birth, while as for calculating, some seem to me never to get a share of it. And the many do so quite late. Yes, by Zeus, I said. What you have said is fine. Moreover, in beasts, one could see that what you say is so. And so them could be added the testimony of Homer, when that we cited in that other place somewhere earlier. He smote his breast and reproached his heart with word. Here, you see, Homer clearly presents that which he has calculated about better and worse, and rebukes that which is irrationally spirited, as though it were a different part. What you say is entirely correct. Well, we've had a hard swim through that, and pretty much agreed that the same classes that are in the city are in the soul of each one severally, and that their number is equal. Yes, that's so. Isn't it by now necessary that the private man be wise in the same way, and because of the same thing as the city was wise? Of course. And further, that a city be courageous because of the same thing, and in the same way as a private man is courageous, and that in everything else that has to do with both virtue and that in everything else that has to do with virtue both are alike? Yes, that is necessary. And further, Glaucon, I suppose will say that a man is just in the same manner that a city too was just. This too is entirely necessary. Moreover, we certainly haven't forgotten that this city was just because each of the three classes in it minds its own business. We haven't, in my opinion, forgotten, he said. Then we must remember that, for each of us too, the one within whom each of the parts minds its own business will be just and mind its own business. Indeed, that must be remembered. Isn't it proper for the calculating part to rule, since it is wise and has forethought about all of the soul, and for the spirited part to be obedient to it and its ally? Certainly. So, as we were saying, won't a mixture of music and gymnastic make them accordant, tightening the one and training it in fair speeches and learning, while relaxing the other with soothing tales, taming it by harmony and rhythm? Quite so, he said. And these two, thus trained and having truly learned their own business and being educated, will be set over the desiring, which is surely most of the soul in each, and by nature most insatiable for money, and they'll watch it for fear of its being filled with the so-called pleasures of the body, and thus becoming big and strong, and then not minding its own business, but attempting to enslave and rule what is not appropriately ruled by its class, and subverting everyone's entire life. Most certainly, he said. So I said, wouldn't these two do the finest job of guarding against enemies from without, on behalf of all of the soul and body, the one deliberating, the other making war, following the ruler, and with its courage fulfilling what has been decided? Yes, that's so. And then I suppose we call a single man courageous because of that part, when his spirited part preserves, through pains and pleasures, what has been proclaimed by the speeches about that which is terrible and that which is not. Correct, he said. And wise because of that little part which ruled in him and proclaimed these things. It, in its turn, possesses within it the knowledge of that which is beneficial for each part and for the whole, composed of the community of these three parts. Most certainly. And what about this? Isn't he moderate because of the friendship and accord of these parts, when the ruling part and the two ruled parts are of the single opinion that the calculating part ought to rule, and don't raise faction against it? Moderation, surely, he said, is nothing other than this, in city or in private man. Now, of course, a man will be just because of that, which we are so often saying, and in the same way, quite necessarily. What about this, I said? Has our justice in any way been blunted, so as to seem to be something other than what it came to light as in the city? Not in my opinion, he said. If there are still any doubts in our soul, I said, we could reassure ourselves completely by testing our justice in the light of the vulgar standards. Which ones? For example, if, concerning this city, and the man who by nature and training is like it, we were required to come to an agreement about whether, upon accepting a deposit of gold or silver, such a man would seem to be the one to filch it. Do you suppose anyone would suppose that he would be the man to do it, and not rather those who are not such as he is? No one would, he said. And as for the temple robberies, thefts, and betrayals, either of the comrades in private or in cities in public, wouldn't this man be beyond them? Yes, he would be beyond them. And further, he would in no way whatsoever be faithless in oaths or in agreements, or in other agreements? Of course not. Further, adultery, neglect of parents, and failure to take care for the gods are more characteristic of every other kind of man than this one? Of every other kind indeed, he said. Isn't the cause of all of this that, so far as ruling and being ruled are concerned, each of the parts in him minds its own business? That and nothing else is the cause. Are you still looking for justice to be something different from this power which produces such men and cities? No, by Zeus, he said, I'm not. Then that dream of ours has reached its perfect fulfillment. I mean, our saying that we suspected that straight from the beginning of the city's founding, through some god, we probably hit upon an origin and model for justice. That's entirely certain. And this, Glaucon, turns out to be, after all, a kind of phantom of justice. That's also why it's helpful. The fact that the shoemaker by nature rightly practices shoemaking and does nothing else, and the carpenter practices carpentry, and so on for the rest. It looks like it. But in truth, justice was, as it seems, something of this sort. However, not with respect to a man's minding his external business, but with respect to what is within, with respect to what truly concerns him and his own. He doesn't let each part in him mind other people's business, or the three classes in the soul meddle with each other, but really sets his own house in good order and rules himself. He arranges himself, becomes his own friend, and harmonizes the three parts, exactly like three notes in a harmonic scale, lowest, highest, and middle. And if there are some other parts in between, he binds them together and becomes entirely one from many, moderate and harmonized. Then, and only then, he acts. If he does act in some way, either concerning the acquisition of money, or the care of the body, or something political, or concerning private contracts, in all these actions he believes and names a just and fine action, one that preserves and helps to produce this condition, and wisdom the knowledge that supervises this action, while he believes and names an unjust action one that undoes this condition, and lack of learning, in its turn, the opinion that supervises this action. Socrates, he says, what you say is entirely true. All right, I said. If we should assert that we have found the just man and city and what justice really is in them, I don't suppose we'd seem to be telling an utter lie. By Zeus, no indeed. Last 2 pages. Shall we assert it then? Let's assert it. So be it, I said. After all, I suppose injustice must be considered I suppose injustice must be considered plainly. Mustn't it? In its turn, be a certain faction among those three, a meddling interference and rebellion of a part of the soul against the whole. The purpose of the rebellious part is to rule in the soul, although that is not proper, since by nature it is fit to be a slave to that which belongs to the ruling class. Something of the sort, I suppose, will say, and that the confusion and wandering of these parts are injustice, licentiousness, cowardice, lack of learning, and, in some, vice entire. Certainly, he said, that is what they are. Then I said, as for performing unjust actions and being unjust, and again, doing just things, isn't what all of them are by now clearly manifest? If injustice and justice are also manifest, how so? Because, I said, they don't differ from the healthy and the sick. What these are in the body, they are in the soul. In what way? He said. Surely healthy things produce health, and sick ones sickness. Yes. Doesn't doing just things also produce justice, and unjust ones injustice? Necessarily. To produce health is to establish the parts of the body in relation of mastering and being mastered by one another, that is, according to nature, while to produce sickness is to establish a relation of ruling and being ruled by one another that is contrary to nature. It is. Then, in its turn, I said, isn't to produce justice to establish the parts of the soul in a relation of mastering and being mastered by one another that is according to nature, while to produce injustice is to establish a relation of ruling and being ruled by one another that is contrary to nature. Entirely so, he said. Virtue, then, as it seems, would be a certain health, beauty, and good condition of a soul, and vice a sickness, ugliness, and weakness. so it is. Don't fine practices also condone the acquisition of virtue and base ones to vice? Necessarily. So as it seems, it now remains for us to consider whether it is profitable to do just things, practice fine ones, and be just, whether or not one's being such remains unnoticed, or whether it is profitable to do injustice and be unjust, provided one doesn't pay the penalty and become better as a result of punishment. But Socrates, he said, that inquiry looks to me as though it has become ridiculous by now. If life doesn't seem livable with the body's nature corrupted, not even with every sort of food and drink and every sort of wealth and every sort of rule, will it then be livable when the nature of that very thing by which we live is confused and corrupted? Even if a man does whatever else he might want except that which will rid him of vice and injustice, and will enable him to acquire justice and virtue. Isn't this clear now that all these qualities have manifested their characters in our description? Yes, it is ridiculous, I said, but all the same, since we've come to the place from which we are able to see most clearly that these things are so, we mustn't worry. Least of all by Zeus, he said. Must we shrink back? Now come here, I said, so you too can see just how many forms vice, in my opinion, has. Those, at least, that are worth looking at. I am following, he said. Just tell me. Well, I said, now that we've come up to this point in the argument, from a lookout as it were, it looks to me as though there is one form of virtue and an unlimited form for vice. It looks to me as though there is one form for virtue and an unlimited number for vice, but some four among them are also worth mentioning. How do you mean? There are, I said, likely to be as many types of soul as there are types of regimes possessing distinct forms. How many is that? 5 of regimes, and I said, and 5 of soul. Tell me what they are, he said. I say that one type of regime would be the one we've described, but it could be named in 2 ways, I said. If one exceptional man arose among the rulers, it would be called a kingship. If more, an aristocracy. True, he said. Therefore, I said, I say that this is one form, for whether it's many or one who arise, none of the city's laws that are worth mentioning would be changed. If he uses that rearing and education we described, it's not likely. The end of book 4. Next time we'll pick it up with book 5. I think it's interesting. He's going to take this argument further and talk about the different types of political systems that should be considered in relation to like the tripart soul, the virtues and vices, and how those relate to the classes of citizens, and how we can use the exploration of the soul, of justice, and of the class system to then come to a decision about how best to structure the political system in general. And I do believe that's coming up in book 5. He also has some wild takes in book 5, like he doesn't believe that a family unit should exist, but rather that children should be of the city and should just go where they would be best suited. So children who have a predisposition towards guardianship should be raised by guardians, and those towards rulers, those children who have an affinity for rulership should go that way as well. And so like wild takes. And so obviously there's much to be discussed and to be considered, but what's interesting is that we're going to start book 5 by reading some of the interpretive essay, because what the interpretive essay says is that book 5 is kind of a what does he say here? He says it on 380. And I just want to kind of just introduce these topics before we go into them tomorrow. Book 5 is preposterous. This is the interpretive essay by Alan Bloom at the back. And Socrates expects it to be ridiculed. So notably, like, this is completely against Athenian culture, completely against everything that we know to be true from our own human natures, that children should spend time with their parents. Like, that is just such a natural predisposition, but he's challenging these, like, he's challenging these most basic social arrangements and is trying to really get after what a good city should and could look like, which is very interesting. And perhaps he even meant these things, but yeah, I guess we'll have to read it and consider it for ourselves tomorrow or whenever we get to it, and take it from there. So thanks for those few of you who decide to come along on this journey with me. It's certainly been fun so far. Anyways, toodaloo!